A warning for listeners. This episode contains descriptions of abusive treatment of prisoners.
Previously on Sugarland.
Until we've identified those folks definitively, we can't memorialize them.
Dr. Katrina Whitley and I formed a group to fund the DNA extraction, the community outreach, as well as the genealogical study that will allow us to not only find descendants of the men that were buried there, but also so that we can give their names back.
It's really only after you've gathered every census and every possible vital record for somebody that you can look at the whole picture and you say, well, what conclusions can we draw from this body of evidence?
I consistently hear, like, the name of the cemetery. Why is it named the way it's named? I don't know, okay?
There's a famous old folk song about a train that shines its light into prisoners' cells as it passes by each night. You may have heard of it. Midnight Special by blues singer Hughie Ledbetter, better known as Leadbelly. According to music scholars, the train's light was a symbol of hope, a lone bit of brightness in the inmates' otherwise rough and repetitive lives. It signaled that someday they would get out and it would take them away. In the early 1920s, Leadbelly was incarcerated in Sugarland. He warns men to be on their best behavior if they're ever in Houston. Because if you messed around, Sugarland's path towards this rough reputation started in the 1880s when two wealthy businessmen moved to town and bought most of the land. On it, they began operating the state's largest convict lease plantations side by side.
We've spent the previous 6 episodes unpacking everything that's happened since the graves of the Sugarland 95 were uncovered. But now we want to tell you how they got here in the first place. A story that our research shows Forpin ISD, Principal Research Group, and the Texas Historical Commission got wrong.
This is part 7 of Sugarland, an investigative podcast series presented by the Texas Newsroom. We're your hosts, Naomi Reed
and Brittany Martin. We began noticing cracks in the official narrative endorsed by the state, the school district, and PRG almost as soon as we started working on this project.
Way back in the spring of 2021.
Some were relatively small. A cursive D in old documents was seemingly mistaken for an A, so parts of PRG's report refer to the first man to lease convicts on this land as J.A. Freeman rather than his real name, James D. Freeman. But other mistakes, like the cemetery's name, had much bigger consequences.
My question is about the decision to call this place a Bullhead Camp Cemetery.
The naming of the camp.
The name of the cemetery.
The name.
The name.
The Bullhead Camp Cemetery name has been the subject of controversy ever since it was made public. In PRG's final report, the Bullhead Camp Cemetery name appears over 130 times. Just weeks after its publication, the organization Reginald Moore founded, the Convict Leasing and Labor Project, posted a blog entry on their website detailing why that name was wrong. While this may not seem like that big of a deal to most people, it's more than just a name on some signs. The actual Bullhead Camp Cemetery is out there. But as of now, no one knows where it is. Continuing to call the Sugarland 95 Cemetery Bullhead Camp erases the existence of this other very real place containing the graves of an untold number of people who died under the convict lease system. So how did we get here?
One night early in our reporting, I attended a presentation by archaeologist Rain Clark at the Sam Houston Memorial Museum in Huntsville, where he explained how he and his team first discovered the Bullhead Camp name.
I'm going to read this section. This is a prison guard that worked at these camps that's being interviewed by a senator.
In 1909, a group of Texas lawmakers investigating the prison system traveled to convict labor camps throughout the state and spoke with prisoners, guards, doctors, chaplains, and administrators. Among them was a former sergeant named R.J. Ritchie. Rain read part of Ritchie's testimony where he talks about burying convicts who died at the lease camps.
all except one buried with convict clothes on. Coffin is made of rough lumber, clothing consisting of a shirt and pants. Coffins are lined with nothing, generally have on each camp what is known as a convict graveyard. The Bullhead camp had a graveyard about 300 yards from the camp in the corner of a pasture. He's describing our cemetery here on Bullhead Bayou, a few hundred yards away from the camp down this road. The cemetery is located right.
Rain had pulled up a hand-drawn map of a convict lease plantation in Sugarland, owned by a man named Littlebury Ambrose Ellis. The cemetery wasn't marked, but Rain pointed to the place where it was found. According to the map, it was on the southern edge of a grass pasture along Bullhead Bayou. Based on that alone, it does sound like the graveyard Sergeant Ritchie described.
But Ritchie's quote was taken from a report consisting of over 1,000 typed pages. And in its full context, it's clear that the Bullhead camp wasn't where Rain thought it was at all. Here's what Jay Jenkins of the Convict Leasing and Labor Project had to say.
We used the testimony that the school district and the historical commission cited as the reason to call it Bullhead Camp. But if you read again further in that testimony, it's clear like that guard never worked at an Ellis camp. Like, to me, I'm not sure why this isn't a giant scandal, that the actual historical evidence, that they didn't read the next 3 pages of this guy's testimony.
We did more than read the next 3 pages. We read the whole investigation, and we found that another reference to the Bullhead camp clearly indicated the camp was on the plantation next to Ellis's, the Cunningham plantation.
Edward H. Cunningham owned over 12,000 acres in Sugarland and set up several convict lease camps on his property. Each camp had separate convicts assigned to it with their own barracks, guards, and supplies, and the state knew them as E.H. Cunningham No. 1, E.H. Cunningham No. 2, and so on.
At one point, Cunningham had up to 6 convict camps on his land.
There is no question whatsoever that the Bullhead camp that Ritchie and several others mentioned in the 1909 investigation was on Cunningham's property, and the cemetery we've spent this whole series talking about was on Ellis's.
Again, this means there is another cemetery, the real Bullhead camp, somewhere on Cunningham's former plantation, somewhere in Sugarland, that still hasn't been found. Building on the Convict Leasing and Labor Project's research, we spent months further proving this. Not just once, but over and over and over again. We took every mention of the Bullhead camp and the guards and convicts associated with it and cross-referenced their names and descriptions with prison employment records, convict registers, and newspaper clippings.
We reviewed over 200 handwritten deeds from the Fort Bend County Clerk's collection of property records and the Texas General Land Office's land grant database. And I asked my college roommate, who happens to have a master's degree in city planning from MIT, to help me map out the whole Sugarland area from the 1800s to now, just to prove that the land where the cemetery was found was never part of the Cunningham plantation.
PRG, Fort Bend ISD, and the Texas Historical Commission have been asked countless times, both in public and in private, about the historical accuracy of the cemetery name. The Convict Leasing and Labor Project circulated a petition to get the name changed, and interrupted a Sugarland 95 memorial event attended by Fort Bend ISD administrators, which had the desired effect of raising awareness about the name controversy.
Despite all the attention and evidence, the Bullhead name remains. A spokesman for the Texas Historical Commission told me, quote, "That is the only documented name that could be found during the historical research on this convict labor camp." And when I asked how they evaluated PRG's full report for historical accuracy, he said that all reports were reviewed by experienced historical commission staff.
And typically, that would be the end of it. But we feel a responsibility to correct the record. And beyond that, present a fuller story about who the Sugarland 95 were and what they experienced under the Texas convict lease system.
Had we taken PRG's report and the quality of the Texas Historical Commission's review at face value, we'd never have discovered the truly remarkable American story we have to share today.
Allow us to introduce you to Watt Bonner.
Way back in the spring of 2021, I'd spent a whole morning looking for a man on PRG's original list of convicts named William Bonner, who was convicted of theft in Bastrop County in 1879. He was listed as widowed and would have been around 30 at the time, which was on the older side for this group of men.
Since Bonner wasn't the most common last name, we thought for sure we'd be able to find something on him.
But no luck. Later that night, though, I was researching a different name on the list, John Norton. He was also convicted in Bastrop County in 1879. According to news reports I found, Norton and another black man were accused of stabbing a Bastrop County sheriff's deputy when he was trying to arrest a, quote, Negro gambler. All three of the black men involved were arrested and jailed.
The local newspaper listed Norton as one of 13 people being held in the county jail on this particular day in February 1879. And running down that list, another name caught our eye, Watt Bonner.
I went back to the list in the report and saw that William Bonner was transferred to the prison on the same day as John Norton. They were sent to the same camp, and their convict numbers were only 4 digits apart. That means they were processed around the same time. So William and Watt? They had to be the same guy.
We decided to look up the convict records for ourselves and found that his name wasn't listed as William or Watt. It was just W. Bonner, the initial, and that's it.
A deep dive into state archives eventually revealed a total of 7 documents containing Mr. Bonner's name. In 4, he is simply referred to as W. Bonner. In 2, he is either Matt or Watt Bonner with 1 T, and in another, he is Matt or Watt Bonner with 2 T's. Cursive W's at that time look a lot like M's, so that could be where the discrepancy comes from. Regardless, the name William appears nowhere we could find. And I hate to think what would have happened had we not uncovered the story of the man we've come to know as Watt Bonner.
Watt Bonner was born into slavery in Alabama in the late 1840s and moved to Texas with his enslavers when he was still very young.
I started calling these slave owners the white Bonners to distinguish them from the enslaved Bonners, like Watt.
While we recognize the potentially problematic nature of this kind of racially marked shorthand, it really did help us keep things straight. So going forward, we'll refer to the white Bonners and the black Bonners to distinguish between Watt and the people who enslaved him. But we in no way intend to diminish either party's humanity.
The white Bonners were an Irish family who immigrated to the U.S. in the 1760s and eventually made their way to Alabama. They were known for being highly educated. In fact, 3 of the 5 white Bonner brothers were doctors. But they made their real money in agriculture. The brothers operated several successful plantations in Alabama. Then, opportunity knocked in Texas.
2 of the white Bonner brothers settled in Freestone County, about halfway between Houston and Dallas in the early 1850s. With over 100 slaves between them, the Bonners were the largest land and slave owners in the county. When the Civil War began in 1861, the of-age white Bonners enlisted in the Confederate Army.
Finding information about the white Bonners is fairly easy, but the same can't be said of Watt and the other black Bonners. To date, we've only found 1 physical document that offers any definitive proof that Watt was enslaved by the white Bonners in Freestone County. It's a letter dated May 29, 1864, and it reads, in part,
"The military authorities have seized Irvin B.'s boy, Watt. He was one of the Bonner Negroes who first ran away from here."
I understand this doesn't sound like much, but I promise it's significant. First, we know Irvin B. is Irvin Bonner, the youngest son of one of the wealthy white Bonner brothers. In 1864, Irvin and his cousin Mac Bonner met up with other soldiers from Freestone County who were stationed in Texas, including Mac's uncle, Dr. Thomas B. Grayson. Dr. Grayson sent dozens of letters to his wife during the war, including the one that mentions Watt.
Frankly, we weren't super familiar with what was happening in Texas during the Civil War, since so many of the major battles we've heard about took place further east. So we reached out to a local history buff to find out what was going on here.
My name is Andy Hall. I live in Galveston, Texas, and I have been a longtime researcher of local maritime and military history.
Andy Hall runs a blog called Dead Confederates, because his ancestors are just that, dead Confederates. The blog explores the history of the Civil War with a special focus on Texas and digs into its lasting legacy.
Andy told us wealthy Confederate soldiers often brought 1 or more of their slaves with them to cook, clean, set up camp, dress them, and do whatever else needed doing while they were away from home. Andy said based on Grayson's letters, we can assume that Irvin had Watt with him for this reason.
If you went into a Confederate encampment, there would be African American people all over the place because they were the ones who were brought in to do the work.
We know from the letters that Irvin and Mac Bonner traveled south with Grayson's company to Galveston, where Grayson sent his May 29th letter. They were stationed there to make sure the Union didn't take control of the port.
Galveston, in the last 2 years of the war, when Watt Bonner was here, Galveston was an armed camp. There was always a U.S. Navy squadron off Galveston.
While the white Bonner boys weren't seeing much, if any, action, the black Bonners, including Watt, were likely kept quite busy, put to work building up Galveston's defenses.
There were literally hundreds of black laborers on the island who were doing the heavy construction because they didn't have any construction machinery then. It was all done by hand with picks and shovels and wheelbarrows, and it was really awful stuff.
They built forts, laid rail lines, and erected a huge wall of sand along the island's perimeter for extra protection. Grayson's letters reflect the harsh conditions.
Galveston, May 4th, 1864. There are a great many of the freestone Negroes at work here. They annoy me very much about getting them off home. Reuben has been quite sick with pneumonia. I took him in the quarters with me and shall keep him until he gets well. Mr. Robinson's man, Beebe, has been also right sick with flux. I also took charge of him. I do not know that his master will ever thank me for it. I shall do everything I can for the up-country Negroes, thanks or no thanks.
On his blog, Andy spends a lot of his time correcting myths that romanticize the South's motivations and actions during the war, including the kinds of roles the South forced black men to assume.
Slaveholders like Irvin and Dr. Grayson, they could be very paternalistic toward them. One of the things that I've found in dealing with Confederate fanboys and fangirls is that they look at writings like the letters you're talking about, where sometimes the enslaved person is referred to in a positive way or there is some concern mentioned about them, and they read that as, oh, they were buddies, and they were, well, no, they weren't. There was a social and cultural gap between them that was beyond anything most of us today will ever experience. And these Confederate soldiers, they went to a lot of trouble to convince themselves that these other camp servants are running off, but my quote-unquote boy won't. And they convinced themselves of that right up to the point where they ran away.
Remember our original letter?
The military authorities have seized Irvin B.'s boy, Watt. He was one of the Bonner Negroes who first ran away from here.
At some point, while Irvin and the others were in Galveston, Watt tried to escape and was captured.
Watt is in Galveston, and he decides to make a break for it. All right, Galveston's an island. You're not going very far, with one exception. You get a boat and you get out to the Union fleet, which is 500 yards off that way. And that happened actually, they guarded against that. There were Confederate soldiers who tried to do that. If Watt was trying to escape, he must have, I would guess he was trying to escape to the blockading fleet, which if he could get hold of a boat would not have been difficult to do.
And the military authorities Dr. Grayson says captured Watt must have been the Confederates, because Galveston was under martial law at the time. We've searched and searched, but we can't find any record of Watt's imprisonment in Galveston. Andy thinks he was probably just released back to Irvin Bonner, but we can't know for sure. What we do know is that just over a year after Watt's escape attempt, Union General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston with General Order No. 3 in hand. It read, "The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free."
That day is now commemorated as Juneteenth. We wondered if there was any chance Watt was still in Galveston then.
And it seems possible. Maybe he was forced to keep building up the island's defenses. Either way, for years, Watt Bonner had a front row seat to the battle over his freedom, and was forced to watch it play out from the wrong side.
When the Civil War came to an end, the federal government established the Freedmen's Bureau to help formerly enslaved people transition into free society. One of its major contributions was the establishment of schools for newly freed black children and adults.
One night, really early in our search for Watt Bonner, I came across his name in a batch of Freedmen's Bureau records. It was at the bottom of a report that showed how many students were enrolled in a Grimes County school that month. Watt had actually signed the report in curly cursive, and just next to his name was his title, Teacher. At At first, I questioned whether or not it could even be the same man. I knew Black people eventually taught at Freedmen's schools, but I wasn't sure how common that was in the first few months that they were open. Skeptically, we scoured the Freedmen's Bureau records for other mentions of Watt.
And we found dozens.
My favorite is this letter Watt sent to the man in charge of Freedmen's Bureau schools in Texas in November 1868.
To Mr. Joseph Welch, sir, I am the said Watt Bonner. I've been a regular school teacher for freedmen and refugees in the said state of Texas for the last 3 years. And now I wish very much to bring my school under the rule of the government. It is said by most of our school agents who have visited our schools in times past that I've had the discipline of the best school system that they have ever seen taught for freedmen in the state of Texas.
Then he wrote this poem that shows his incredible passion for teaching and shatters my heart every time I hear it.
I am a colored gentleman. Watt Bonner is my name. And to educate the children has always been my aim. I'm in a great hopes that you will ordain and license me as a regular government school sergeant. I will thank you more than much to forward me an immediate reply and send the license with the answer. I remain your most obedient servant, Watt Bonner.
We used this and other records to map out a timeline of Watt's career as a teacher. Texas's first freedmen's school opened in Galveston in September 1865, and within 4 months, Watt had landed his first teaching job in Houston, which would have made him one of the first Black educators in the state.
Right, and the records show that Watt seemingly had a brother named Henderson Bonner who taught with him in Houston, too.
I come from a long line of Black educators in Texas, so Watt's story is very personal to me. The idea that his history could have been lost forever is even more devastating given this connection.
As we've explained in previous episodes, it was often hard to find any information about the men who could be among the Sugarland 95. No family, no tax records, no mentions in the newspaper. This was so far beyond what we thought was possible to find. We had these 3 Watt Bonners: the slave, the teacher, and eventually the convict, each with his own tangible, individual identity, which, when combined, basically becomes a Shakespearean tragedy.
We had to know if our 3 Watt Bonners were one and the same. So we brought everything we'd found to Franklin Smith, a professional genealogist who worked for years at the Clayton Library Center for Genealogical Research in Houston. He's retired now, but he agreed to help us look into Watt's past.
The slave to teacher connection feels good to me. I feel like those are probably the same people.
I do too. Watt is not a very standard name. It's not a usual name. It's a very infrequently found name. The fact that they're both literate and they're Bonners, you find the Henderson name in their records and the Watt name. It just amazes me, how did that guy learn to read and write that well? Both of them. How did they learn to read and write so that before 1870, basically, he's writing and reading on a level that would, indicate that he had been doing this for quite a while.
Talking through this stuff with Franklin made it feel like we were putting together a puzzle. We laid all our documents out in front of us with sections highlighted and notes written in the margins. Each time I looked up, I saw the top of Franklin's bald head, his brows furrowed and his eyes squinting as he searched for meaning in all the mess.
The circumstantial proof indicates and clearly supports to me that he is the same Watt Bonner that was the teacher.
That's the phrase Franklin kept using, circumstantial proof.
I just think that will go a long ways as circumstantial proof that he had a brother that was also involved in education. It's cumulative evidence that you're looking at. The accumulation of evidence points in that direction. What you would have to do is try to disprove it. So you haven't found another Watt Bonner anywhere that could be this Watt Bonner. About the same age, same name, you haven't found that you've tried to find all the Watt Bonners. And this is the only time in Texas that you're able to find a Watt Bonner.
Franklin said teaching in a large urban place like Houston would have provided more protection for a Black teacher like Watt. But he ventured out. By January of 1867, Watt had begun teaching in Colorado County, about 70 miles west of Houston.
They may have had enough teachers there and asked him, or he volunteered, who knows. They'd have had to push me. That was very courageous.
Franklin's right. The Freedmen's Bureau records contain tons of letters from teachers at schools across the South, detailing the violence they and their students faced on a regular basis. In 1871, a man in Bastrop claimed the KKK showed up at his door while out hunting for black teachers. And in Tyler, in 1868, when a group of black children refused to move off of a sidewalk so white people could pass, the white people of the town spent the next 2 days beating the children with clubs and stones as they walked to school. Their teacher suspended classes, afraid the kids were going to be killed. Then the mayor threatened to burn the school down if she resumed teaching. When the Freedmen's Bureau agent in charge of the region threatened to arrest the mayor just scoffed and told him to go ahead. Local freedmen told the agent an arrest would worsen the racist violence. He knew they were right. The Texas Superintendent of Education adopted a policy that pushed for Bureau schools to be opened only in towns guarded or reachable by federal troops.
Which just makes Watt Bonner's career even more impressive. In Colorado County, he taught night school, and his students were almost all adults, who likely came to class after working all day. Eventually, he began teaching day school as well, which included more children. Then, near the end of 1868, Watt relocated again, this time to Grimes County, another rural spot about 70 miles away from Houston.
Where the biggest administration office was, I would have stayed there, venturing out in a place like Colorado, kind of Grimes, if you don't know anything about it. That would have taken a lot of courage at that time, because you had these white folks that were still bitter and angry, and to find a black man that could read and write that had formerly been enslaved in Texas, they wouldn't have wanted him to educate the local black people.
In July 1869, Watt Bonner wrote to the man in charge of freedmen's schools in Texas again.
I expect to locate myself to Navasota if I can finally get the school open. If I get up and started by Monday coming, I will write immediately and let you know it.
He's starting these schools. He's getting these schools off the ground. He's excited about it, and he's dedicated. My God, this man, he's a hero. He's truly a hero for education.
And he really was. In the 5 years after slavery ended, Watt taught at 5 different schools across southeast Texas. The last time his name appears in the Freedmen's Bureau records was in January of 1870, when he filed a report from Navasota, from the school he succeeded in opening there. The Bureau ceased operations in Texas 6 months later, and then we lose track of Watt for a long time. Texas's only prison was just 11 years old when the Civil War began. It opened in Huntsville in 1849 and housed just 3 convicts that first year. The prison population grew as more and more people poured into Texas, but it grew slowly until the Civil War came to an end. From 1860 to 1865, the prison admitted, on average, 43 new inmates per year. In 1866, they admitted 261 new inmates.
Before the Civil War, the prison population was almost entirely white in Texas.
This is Robert Perkinson, author of Texas Tough, one of the most comprehensive and more recent books on Texas prison history, race, and criminal justice.
The biggest prison boom in Texas history before the 80s and 90s was in the 1860s and 70s as the convict leasing system got set up. So it's true that a portion of the growth was related to population, but what really accelerated that growth was disciplining by government free people who had previously been controlled in every way by their owners.
The state's first black prisoners arrived in Huntsville immediately after Texas's slaves were freed in June of 1865, and by the next year, 75% of all new prisoners were black.
Southern slave masters had kind of paranoia as a central motivating current of their politics. And everything was about trying to figure out how to preserve their rights, their sovereignty.
The white ruling class was terrified of losing their power, which honestly makes sense. They'd lost the war, their slaves, and their wealth. They became increasingly desperate, passing a series of laws that criminalized Black life and made it nearly impossible for African Americans to gain a foothold in the South.
These laws are often referred to as the Black Codes. They made crimes out of mundane aspects of free Black life and nearly guaranteed Black imprisonment. Things like vagrancy, being unemployed, or having a supposed outstanding debt to a former enslaver or sharecropper, those were all things that could land Black people in jail. The Black Codes were formally nullified during Reconstruction, but similar laws still managed to crop up in their place. And once Reconstruction ended, the pace of repressive laws vastly increased. For instance, many Black people were arrested for allegedly stealing a pig or a horse under what were called the pig laws. Of course, often these debts or thefts were fictitious and just excuses to abduct, imprison, and exploit Black men. But once arrested, the state had to figure out what to do with them.
By 1871, there were less than 240 cells at the prison in Huntsville and over 600 inmates. Nearly 90% of the inmates spent all day in their cells because there wasn't enough work to go around. The textile factory, where convicts spun cotton into uniforms for Confederate soldiers during the war, needed new machinery and access to a lot more cotton to stay competitive. The upgrades were going to cost nearly $250,000.
And Texas didn't have that.
It was during the war and then immediately after the war when impoverished, smashed Southern governments were trying to figure out how to carry on government services without a lot of revenue, A, and B, when they were trying to figure out what to do with this massive population that was suddenly emancipated, and if they did break laws or were accused of breaking laws, would be disciplined by the state rather than by their owners. You know, it was in that turmoil. And even during the Civil War that they first started experimenting with labor contracts to subcontract out the population of prisoners that were too much for them to handle.
At first, Texas tried leasing out groups of incarcerated men to work on individual railroad projects. But those early contracts didn't last very long. Many of the men escaped, and the penitentiary wasn't receiving regular payments from the lessees. So they were all brought back to Huntsville, and the lease experiment went on a little hiatus. That is until 1871, when the governor of Texas handed the prison keys to Ward Dewey and Company from Galveston.
This is how it was supposed to work. Ward, Dewey & Co. would pay $325,000 to lease the whole prison for 15 years. While that's a lot of money, even now, it gave them a guaranteed workforce of 600 inmates and counting that they could do whatever they wanted with. And whatever profit they made from convict labor, they got to keep. So within the prison, they had the convicts making clothes, cabinets, chairs, and all kinds of stuff like that. And they also sent groups of convicts back out to work on railroads and farms. The companies and farmers who leased them paid Ward, Dewey & Co. a small amount per convict.
They were literally subletting human beings, just like you would a house.
During their lease term, Ward, Dewey & Co. were supposed to build new workshops, purchase new machinery, and make the penitentiary more livable. That was a huge win for the state because it meant not only did Texas not have to pay to run the penitentiary, they also didn't have to pay for all the upgrades the facility needed to make it profitable in the future. So, in theory, the state, the lessees, and the companies who were subletting convicts were all making money. Almost sounds too good to be true, doesn't it?
It was. In 1874, just 3 years into the Ward Dewey lease, 67 military prisoners were transferred from the penitentiary in Texas to one in Kansas. Kansas officials reported that many of the prisoners were emaciated and sick when they arrived. Some died, while others took months to recover.
In his book, Penology for Profit, Donald R. Walker questioned if, up until this point, state leaders either didn't know about the abuses taking place or simply chose to ignore them. Whatever the case, he wrote, as charges against the management of the prison began to be heard, state officials were forced to take action.
A 3-man committee was sent to Huntsville to talk to prisoners, guards, community members, and the lessees themselves, and found that things were just as bad, if not worse, than the prisoners in Kansas had said.
The prisoners were reportedly deprived of even the most basic comforts, such as food, clothes, and places to sleep. Just like Leadbelly sang in Midnight Special, The convicts were fed basically the same thing every day. On a good day, breakfast consisted of cornbread, beef, and cornmeal coffee, which was either ground coffee mixed with cornmeal or just boiled cornmeal. And for dinner, they usually got more cornbread, beef, and soup with an occasional vegetable thrown in.
The investigating committee found this to be adequate, though a bit lacking in variety. But the men said good days like that were few and far between. John Connor told investigators the food had gotten worse the longer he was in prison.
For the first 6 months I was here, we had cornbread and molasses about once a week and good coffee. Ever since then, we've had nothing but cornbread, corn coffee, and the meat is of the very worst description. It gets worse and worse from one day to another. I have not seen any vegetables here for 5 months. I cannot eat the soup. The meat is unwashed, gnawed by rats, and then boiled for soup. It's disgusting. I cannot eat it because I know how it's made.
A German immigrant named Otto Pressler, in prison for assault, provided an even more detailed and disgusting description.
We have meat sometimes full of maggots. Once in a while we get good meat. In the wintertime it is generally good, but it is rarely cooked good. We would have enough to eat if we had enough time to eat it in. Sometimes we have enough time, and sometimes not. We're not allowed to bring anything away from the table. That's a punishable offense.
Pressler goes on to say that the men weren't given underclothes in the winter, which seemed to be a recurring problem throughout the convict lease era. In October 1874, an investigator visited the Patton Plantation in Brazoria County, where 48 convicts, almost all of them black, were harvesting sugarcane. He found the men barefooted and nearly naked. Apparently, the sergeant in charge never even bothered to report the problem to the lessees in Huntsville or ask for more clothes.
Then there was actual physical torture. Thomas Morris, an Irishman who served in the Union Army and was in prison in Huntsville for 9 months, told officials in Kansas what happened when convicts broke a rule, disobeyed an order, or just ended up on a guard's bad side.
There was an instrument of torture called a horse, which was made by driving a peg about 1 or 1.5 feet long horizontally into an upright post. This peg was shaped something like a pick handle, with the sharp side up. The prisoner got on this peg astraddle from a stool. The stool was then taken from under his feet, and his legs were tied down by the ankles with ropes to rings in the floor or fastened in the ground. The head was fastened back to the upright post, and the arms were tied.
Basically, these men were made to straddle a sharp stick with their hands, feet, and head, bound in such a way as to ensure all of their weight bore down on the stick between their legs. Another convict, J.B. Hill, provided a more colorful description.
I was taken out and rode on that horse 4 times because I reported the quality of food served to us. I could scarcely pass water for a long time after. They tie men on there for 2 hours. The horse injures the testicles and private parts. After being on 5 minutes, you begin to feel intense pain. I was in the engineering department at Fort Sumter and had been shot 3 times, but the pain is nothing compared to the horse. I'd rather be killed than endure it again. The V impression it made on the secret parts remained there for 5 weeks. The heavier a man is, the worse it is for him. I'd rather be shot than endure it again.
The men were also routinely put in the stocks for punishment. Picture one of those medieval torture devices made out of a block of wood with holes cut out for your head and hands. John Connor, the guy who said he hadn't seen a vegetable in months, told investigators he saw Colonel Ward put a black man in the stocks and beat him.
I saw him punch a stick right in his eye and beat him with his stick. Then he was perfectly useless. They can choke a man right down in these stocks in 2 minutes. They threw water on the Negro I referred to for 2 hours to bring him around.
Beatings, or more often whippings, were a common occurrence both within the walls and at the outside camps. The state investigators visited a camp in Brazoria County and found that a black convict had recently received 604 lashes on his naked back.
We looked at his back, and it was scarified in a most shocking manner.
There was also a lot of testimony taken that suggested Ward and Dewey regularly got drunk and raped the female prisoners. The horrors that women experienced during the convict lease era could be a whole other podcast. They were also made to work on farms at outside camps, and the conditions were just as terrible, if not worse, than they were at the men's camps.
Needless to say, Ward, Dewey, and Co.'s popularity was waning. The governor and board of directors of the penitentiary gave the lessees a whole list of things they needed to improve and established new rules concerning how inmates could be punished. They hoped that Ward Dewey & Co. would make some positive changes and turn things around. But a year later, state lawmakers sent another committee to Huntsville for a follow-up inspection and, shocker, found no improvement. Here's what the lawmaker said.
Instead of a penitentiary for the purposes of punishing the guilty, there exists only a system of the vilest slavery for the benefit of the lessees, and that when the slave becomes unprofitable to them, the duty of maintaining him for the purpose of legal punishment and the safety of society weighs but lightly with the lessees. In conclusion, your committee respectfully and earnestly recommended that the state resume control of its penitentiary and convicts, and that the state never again attempt to lease her penitentiary.
2 months later, in August 1876, the legislature voted to terminate the Ward Dewey lease. But the whole reason Texas leased the prison to begin with was because it was too big and too expensive for the state to manage. When Ward and Dewey took over, there were around 600 prisoners in the whole system. When their lease ended, there were around 1,600.
Ignoring the advice of investigators to never lease the penitentiary again, the state turned right around and leased the penitentiary again. A bunch of new rules were put in place about how the convicts should be fed, clothed, punished, and cared for. They hired a new inspector and assistants who were tasked with visiting the outside camps at least once a month. And they increased reporting requirements, which meant that they were finally keeping a log of the incoming, pardoned, escaped, and dead convicts.
The state's second lease went to Bexar County businessman Edward H. Cunningham. Remember him?
He owned the plantation next door to Littleberry Ellis in Sugar Land. The real Bullhead Camp was one of Cunningham's.
But a few years before he built his giant Sugarland plantation, Cunningham leased the whole state penitentiary. He offered to pay the state $3.01 per convict per month, and was responsible for feeding, clothing, guarding, and transporting them, paying to recapture them if they escaped, and paying their discharge fee. In return, he had full use of the prison, its grounds and workshops, and discretion as to how and where the men worked. He partnered with another key player in our Sugarland story, Littleberry Ellis, who had also placed a bid to lease the penitentiary. Their lease ran for 5 years, from 1878 to 1883.
It wasn't entirely dissimilar to the deal the state struck with Ward and Dewey, but it was certainly better regulated and more transparent, meaning that while it wasn't necessarily more humane, at the very least, it created a paper trail of all the abuses taking place at the time and all the people who knew about them. For example, in March of 1878, just 2 months into the new lease, one of the inspectors wrote that the convicts on the Cabinus farm in Crockett weren't given drinking water during the workday.
The day I visited the farm, one squad was worked from morning till noon without any water, and another squad said they had not had any except some dirty water out of a ditch that was nearby. I spoke to Mr. Cabinus about this negligence, and he said that the barrel needed for hauling water had been left in another part of the farm, and he had not had time to have it brought over to where the men were then working. The men complain of being stalked very severely. I have tried persuasive measures for some time to get these men to comply with the rules and bylaws of the prison in the treatment of convicts, but so far have failed to do so. I have about come to the conclusion that the only way to remedy the evil is to take their force from them.
But that didn't happen. The Cabinus camp was still open and operating on convict labor in July.
This is what we term one of our hard camps, and it is a difficult matter to get the managers of it to do right, notwithstanding my efforts to induce them to do so.
And in November 1878, more of the same.
Cabinus prison was dirty, and some of the convicts had no change of clothing for 2 or 3 weeks. The sergeant said he had no change of clothing for them, which was his excuse for not having the clothing washed. The books of the lessees show that they have had 3 suits each.
Cabinus's farm was one of over 50 different locations convicts were sent to work under the Cunningham and Ellis lease. The duo became especially fond of hiring the men out to cotton and sugarcane farmers, setting around 50% of all the state's prisoners to farm work.
This is around the time Watt Bonner's story picks up again, nearly a decade after he filed his last school report. In those 10 years in between, we don't know where he was living or who he lived with. We don't know if he continued teaching somewhere else or if he had a job at all. All we know is that a man named Watt Bonner was in the Bastrop County Jail in February 1879.
Watt's alleged crime was theft, but we don't know what he was accused of stealing or from whom. We don't know if he had a lawyer or a trial, or if he tried to appeal the verdict. Just that he was convicted and sentenced to 7 years in the state penitentiary. At the time, there were 3 farms using convict labor in Sugar Land, and all 3 were run by men from slave-owning families. Watt was sent to J.D. Freeman's plantation, the largest of the 3 Sugar Land farms.
Watt was one of about 40 incarcerated men working on Freeman's plantation. Records show he managed to escape when he first arrived, but he was recaptured later that month. He was described as a 30-year-old black man weighing 160 pounds and standing 5 feet 8 inches tall. Even though detailed records on the conditions of J.D. Freeman's camp are sparse, it seems pretty on par with the others in the area: hot, humid, and miserable. Many of the prisoner deaths on the Sugar Land farms are attributed to malaria, sunstroke, and even some drownings in the flood-prone Brazos River. Here's what an inspector said after he visited the Sugar Land camps one summer.
I have found that during the months of July and August, it has rained almost every day. The men have consequently been frequently wet, sometimes 2 or 3 times a day. There has been, of course, a great deal of sickness on most of the farms, principally chills and fever.
Despite the harsh conditions, the area's sugar plantations were seeing incredible output. So much so that the lessees, Cunningham and Ellis, couldn't help but take notice.
Ellis purchased the 2,500-acre Freeman plantation in July 1880. He took over Freeman's lease of convicts, placing Watt Bonner under Ellis's direct control.
Ellis bought up 3,300 additional acres over the next 3 years, and Cunningham followed suit. In June of 1882, Cunningham purchased a giant former slave plantation right next door to Ellis, but he didn't start leasing convicts there until September, 3 months before their lease was set to expire.
They asked to renew their lease for an additional 15 years, but the legislature didn't go for it. The profitability of the Cunningham and Ellis lease showed the state they didn't need men like Cunningham and Ellis or anyone else to act as middlemen. They could hand out contracts for convict labor themselves and keep all the money. While this setup was less ideal for new sugar plantation owners Cunningham and Ellis, they certainly made it work. Soon enough, they were operating the 2 largest convict labor plantations in the state, side by side in Sugar Land.
According to Watt Bonner's prison records, he survived only 2.5 years of his 7-year sentence. He came down with pneumonia and died the day before New Year's Eve in 1881. The other convicts likely built him a coffin out of rough pine and lowered his body into the ground while the guards stood watch. His family, if he had any, probably would not have been notified. His name and his convict number might have been written on a wooden headstone, but that's long gone now. And with it, his whole remarkable life story was erased.
I think the tragedy and complexity of Watt's story is a big reason why we care so much about the cemetery name. The name is something so many in the community continue to be upset about. Reginald Moore's friends and family insist he would still be fighting to correct the record. The Bullhead Camp Cemetery that Sergeant Ritchie mentioned in his testimony exists somewhere in Sugar Land, somewhere on land that was once part of Cunningham's plantation. And there are real people buried there, people with real stories, just like Watt Bonner's.
And until PRG, Fort Bend ISD, and the Texas Historical Commission admit that they got this one wrong, their bodies likely won't ever be found, and their histories will continue to be erased.
Next time on Sugar Land.
For them to rename the Sugarland 95, the Bullhead Camp, it literally erases history. And that's a part of history that my family comes from.
That was a big stigma in our family. Was jail is a possibility, a likelihood. If you stay out here, this is what's going to happen.
They're behind razor wire. They're their own kingdoms. Anything goes.
There's nothing that could be done to repair what was lost. Our family has been affected generationally. The only thing that I can ask for at this time is the truth.
We have to call these things out so that they can improve and get better. But there's really sometimes a power structure that just doesn't want things to get better.
Sugarland is a production of the Texas Newsroom and was completed with the support of a grant from Columbia University's Ira A. Littman Center for Journalism and Civil and Human Rights, with funding provided by Arnold Ventures, and a grant from the Convict Leasing and Labor Project. Sugarland is written and reported by Brittany Martin and Naomi Reed. Our editor is Rachel Osier Lindley. Engineering and sound design by Jacob Rosati. Fact-checking by Billy Brennan. Audio editing by Bennett Smith. Music by Jerron Marshall. Recording engineering by Jake Perlman. Production help from Rafa Fariha. Special thanks to everyone who brought the historical letters and documents in this episode to life. Doug Mueller, Robert Hardy, Paul DiBenedetto, Ben Philpott, Andrew Schneider, Joseph Leahy, Jake Perlman, and Terry Fox. And to Michelle Mueller-Gomez and Alan Bozick for helping me create maps of Sugarland from settlement to development. The Texas Newsroom is a public radio journalism collaboration that includes NPR, KERA in North Texas, Houston Public Media, KUT in Austin, Texas Public Radio in San Antonio, and other stations across the state. Corey McLagan is the statewide managing editor. The Texas Newsroom received support for Sugarland from Frontline's Local Journalism Initiative, which is funded by the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Visit sugarlandpodcast.com to learn more about everything we discuss in this series.